Pause for a moment. Do not skip this, because what you are about to hear is not random, and it is not a coincidence that you found this message now. There was a time when people gathered behind closed doors, spoke your name in hushed tones, and quietly agreed on an outcome they believed you would never escape. They planned your silence. They planned your exhaustion. They planned for you to stay confused, small, and doubting yourself. But something happened that disrupted the entire script. You didn't retaliate. You didn't collapse. You didn't chase explanations. You withdrew. And that single decision changed the trajectory of everything. If you've been feeling isolated lately, if friendships faded without explanation, if conversations stopped, invitations disappeared, and the world suddenly went quiet around you, this message is for you. Before we continue, comment, "I am chosen," to align yourself with this message. Like this video so it reaches others who are in this same phase. And subscribe, because what you're entering now requires understanding, not fear. Now, breathe, because what feels like loneliness is actually protection in its highest form. Now, let's dive deeper. When you withdrew, you didn't run. You returned to yourself. You stepped out of rooms where your spirit was being monitored, measured, and slowly drained. And the moment you stopped explaining your heart to people, committed to misunderstanding you, something spiritual and psychological clicked into place. The doors that were never meant for you began to close on their own. That's why the quiet feels so sudden. The silence isn't punishment. It's filtration. It's the removal of noise so you can finally hear your own intuition again. See, some people don't fear your anger. They fear your clarity. They fear the day you stop begging for validation and start moving like you already know who you are. So when you chose distance, the observers lost access. The manipulators lost reaction. The ones feeding off your confusion lost their supply. And because they can't control what they can't reach, they backed away, hoping the isolation would make you crawl back and prove you're still available for their games. But you didn't crawl back. You stayed still. You stayed quiet. You kept your dignity. And that's why this season feels like a spiritual lockdown, because it is, not a cage, but a covering. God will often remove your audience before he reveals your next level. He will separate you before he strengthens you. He will cut off familiar voices so your faith can become internal, not dependent. So if the world gets quiet, don't panic. You're not being rejected. You're being redirected. You're not losing people. You're losing patterns. And what's coming next will require a stronger mind, a cleaner heart, and a smaller circle. This is the phase where you rebuild in private, heal without performing, and become so anchored that even when they try to rewrite the story again, they won't recognize the version of you that emerges. Point 1. The unseen agreement made without you. There is a moment in every chosen individual's life when they realize that not all decisions affecting them were made in their presence. And this realization lands quietly, not like a shock, but like a slow internal click where pieces finally align. At first, it feels uncomfortable because we are conditioned to believe that fairness requires transparency, that truth announces itself clearly, and that betrayal is loud and obvious, but reality operates with far more subtlety. Most plans formed against you were never dramatic or malicious in appearance. They were quiet assumptions, formed in familiar spaces, embedded in casual conversations, shared glances and jokes that carried more intention than humor. What was planned behind your back was not always your destruction, but your containment. There was a silent agreement that you would never exceed the version of yourself they were comfortable understanding, that you would stay emotionally accessible, endlessly forgiving, and always available to explain yourself, justify your growth, and soften your edges for the sake of harmony. The plan was simple and effective. Keep you close enough to influence but small enough to manage, visible but not expansive, gifted but not sovereign. For a time it worked, not because you were weak, but because you were still operating from connection rather than discernment, choosing belonging over clarity and harmony over truth. The loneliness you later felt did not begin when people physically left your life. It began the moment your awareness started to grow faster than their comfort with who you were becoming. You noticed shifts in energy, resistance disguised as concern, distance masked as busyness, and subtle discomfort whenever you spoke from a deeper place. The moment you outgrew the silent agreement, distance became inevitable, because growth exposes contracts that were never meant to last. That distance was not rejection, and it was not punishment. It was the natural collapse of an outdated arrangement that could no longer contain the frequency you were stepping into. What felt like loss was actually liberation in disguise, a necessary separation that protected your expansion and marked the end of a season where others had access to versions of you that no longer existed. Point 2. Why the separation felt sudden and personal. One of the most disorienting experiences for a chosen person is how quickly life can change once the shift begins, because the human mind expects transition to be gradual, negotiated, and explained, while transformation at the soul level rarely asks for permission. Relationships that once felt stable suddenly dissolve without warning. Conversations lose warmth, tones change, and presence fades. Familiar energy becomes distant, even cold, and the shock of this can feel deeply personal, like punishment, rejection, or abandonment. But psychologically and spiritually, it is neither. Sudden separation happens because gradual separation would invite negotiation, guilt, emotional bargaining, and subtle manipulation that keeps old dynamics alive. When change is slow, the ego interferes. When change is sharp, the soul is protected. The mind looks desperately for explanations, replaying moments and searching for mistakes, but the soul recognizes necessity. This phase feels lonely because you're no longer buffered by noise, distraction, or borrowed identity. You are encountering yourself without mirrors, without applause, without resistance, and without interference. For the nervous system, this registers as loss because it has been conditioned to regulate safety through attachment and familiarity. But what is actually happening is recalibration. You're learning to regulate internally rather than externally. You're being trained to generate stability, meaning, and direction from within, rather than drawing it from people, environments, or validation. The loneliness is not evidence of being unwanted. It is evidence that you are no longer being consumed. When attachments fall away quickly, it is often because staying would delay a transformation that cannot be postponed. Certain connections cannot survive the frequency shift because they were built on who you were, not who you are becoming. This is why the separation feels sudden and non-negotiable. It is not cruelty, it is efficiency. The chosen path does not allow prolonged stagnation. It removes what cannot come with you before you have time to doubt the process. In this silence, your perception sharpens, your intuition strengthens, and your internal authority begins to replace external approval. What feels like isolation is actually consolidation. Your energy is being pulled back into itself so it can be reorganized, strengthened, and directed with precision. This is not the end of connection. It is the end of dependency. And once this phase completes, you will reconnect from alignment rather than need, from clarity rather than confusion, and from power rather than survival. Point 3. Isolation as psychological and spiritual containment. Isolation is often misunderstood because society frames connection as safety and solitude as danger. Yet this interpretation ignores a deeper psychological and energetic truth. For certain individuals, especially those with heightened perception, emotional intelligence, or intuitive awareness, constant connection does not nourish, it erodes. Every interaction carries expectations, projections, and subtle demands, and over time these fragments pull the self in too many directions. Isolation, in this context, is not abandonment, but containment. It is the deliberate narrowing of external input so internal coherence can finally assemble. During this phase, your nervous system recalibrates. You may notice heightened sensitivity, deeper emotional processing, sharper pattern recognition, and an almost uncomfortable clarity about people, cycles, and truths you once tolerated without question. This is not weakness surfacing, it is refinement taking place. When access to you decreases, it is because your energy is being protected from fragmentation. Fragmentation occurs when too many voices compete for authorship over your inner world, leaving you reactive instead of sovereign. The loneliness you feel is not punishment, it is unoccupied space, space where clarity grows, where intuition becomes audible, and where self-trust is rebuilt without interference. It feels heavy because distraction has been removed, and without distraction, you are forced to confront your authentic thoughts, unresolved emotions, and unfiltered desires. Yet this discomfort is essential because it restores authorship over your inner narrative. You stop performing versions of yourself that were shaped to survive environments rather than express truth. In isolation, identity stops reacting and starts rooting. You're no longer defined by how others respond to you, but by how aligned you feel with yourself. This phase teaches discernment, emotional economy, and energetic boundaries. It strips away false urgency and social noise, leaving only what is essential. When you eventually re-enter connection, you do so with clarity rather than need, presence rather than hunger, and intention rather than habit. Isolation does not diminish you. It consolidates you. It is the quiet architecture phase before expansion, the recalibration before impact, and the stillness where power reorganizes itself from the inside out. Point 4. The silence that replaced explanation. At some point, you noticed you no longer had the urge to clarify yourself, and that realization did not arrive with noise or announcement. It arrived quietly, like a door closing behind you without regret. You stopped correcting narratives that were never meant to be corrected. You stopped defending intentions to people who had already decided who you were before listening, and in that moment, something fundamental shifted within you. This was not emotional withdrawal, not bitterness, not defeat. It was emotional maturity taking its rightful place. The need to explain oneself is often rooted in the fear of being misunderstood, but chosen individuals eventually discover a deeper truth. Misunderstanding is not always accidental. It is often strategic, intentional, and convenient for those who need you reduced to a version they can control. Silence, then, becomes discernment rather than avoidance. You're no longer interested in being believed by those who benefit from doubting you, no longer invested in persuading minds that profit from distortion. Psychologically, this marks a profound transition from external validation to internal authority, where your sense of self no longer fluctuates with opinions, rumors, or shifting social weather. You trust your perception enough to let others carry their own versions of you, knowing that what they see says more about their internal state than your reality. This silence is not passive or weak. It is active restraint, a conscious decision to step out of unnecessary conflict. It conserves mental and emotional energy that once leaked into explanations, defenses, and emotional labor. It protects focus by eliminating distractions disguised as conversations. It prevents unnecessary entanglement with people who only approach you to pull you into chaos, justification, or self-doubt. There is a loneliness that can accompany this silence, a brief season where fewer voices surround you, but that loneliness is temporary. The clarity it produces, however, is permanent. In that clarity, you finally hear yourself without interference, and that is where real power begins. Point 5. The collapse of their plan through non-reaction. Most manipulative dynamics rely on predictable emotional responses because reaction creates leverage, explanation creates openings, and defense creates engagement. And as long as you were responding, clarifying, justifying, or resisting, the structure around you remained intact and operational. The moment you stopped reacting, something fundamental shifted. The system that depended on your emotional output began to collapse in on itself. This is why the loneliness intensified after your withdrawal. It was not punishment. It was not abandonment. It was the vacuum left behind when you removed yourself from an emotional ecosystem that had been feeding on your presence. Your attention had been currency. Your energy had been fuel. Your predictability had been the map. When you went silent, there was suddenly nothing to manage, nothing to steer, nothing to provoke, and nothing to correct. For those who assumed access to you was permanent, this absence was deeply unsettling. Control does not panic when resisted, it panics when it is ignored. From a psychological perspective, non-reaction breaks conditioning. Patterns require reinforcement. Triggers require responses. Loops require participation. When you stopped supplying emotional data, the learned behaviors around you lost their reference point. Confusion replaced certainty. Projection replaced strategy. From a spiritual perspective, something even more profound occurred. Silence restored sovereignty. You were no longer vibrating in response to external pressure. You were no longer tuning yourself to someone else's frequency. You reclaimed authorship over your inner state. That reclamation often feels like isolation at first, because the nervous system mistakes unfamiliar peace for emptiness. The body has to relearn safety without stimulation, identity without conflict, and worth without validation. This recalibration can feel like loneliness, but it is actually the quiet that follows emancipation. You did not win by confronting them, because confrontation keeps the game alive. You didn't win by explaining yourself, because explanation invites negotiation. You won by becoming unavailable to the game entirely. The loneliness was not evidence of loss. It was the aftershock of freedom settling into a system that had never been allowed to stand on its own. Point 6. The weight of the in-between phase. This phase is often the hardest, not because it is dangerous, but because it is undefined, suspended between identities, stretched across a quiet threshold where the old self no longer fits and the new self has not yet taken form. You are no longer who you were, but not yet visibly who you are becoming. And that in-between state can feel disorienting, even unsettling, because the mind craves labels, timelines, and reassurance. There is little external feedback now, few markers of progress, no applause, no visible milestones, only long stretches of quiet where nothing seems to be happening on the surface. This silence can feel heavy, almost like carrying meaning without language, as if something important is unfolding inside you but refuses to announce itself. Yet this weight is not a burden meant to crush you. It is a pressure meant to shape you. In this stillness, you are building tolerance for being unseen, patience for not knowing, and trust in internal guidance rather than external validation. Psychologically, this is where emotional independence is formed, where you stop needing constant confirmation that you're on the right path and begin to sense it intuitively. You learn to regulate your emotions without distraction, to sit with discomfort without immediately trying to escape it, and to observe your thoughts without being ruled by them. Spiritually, this is where discernment deepens, where you begin to distinguish between impulse and intuition, between noise and truth. You are learning to sit with yourself without rushing toward entertainment, approval, or reassurance, and in doing so, you are strengthening an inner axis that cannot be easily shaken. The loneliness of this phase can be deceptive. It may feel like abandonment, but it is actually refinement. It's the quiet room where clarity is sharpened, where false attachments loosen their grip, and where your inner voice becomes clearer precisely because nothing else is speaking over it. Loneliness here is not emptiness. It is incubation, a protected space where something real is taking shape before it is ready to be seen. Point 7. Protection as the precursor to expansion. Every meaningful expansion requires structure. Without it, growth becomes collapse. This is why protection always precedes visibility. You were not slowed down to frustrate you. You were slowed down to stabilize you. The loneliness you experienced was the strengthening of your internal compass. You learned to self-regulate, self-validate, and self-direct. When expansion arrives, it will not overwhelm you, because you have already learned how to stand without external scaffolding. The people who once planned your limitation are no longer central to your future, not because you rejected them, but because your path outgrew their reach. What comes next will be quieter, more intentional, and more aligned. Connection will return, but it will no longer cost you yourself. This is not the end of isolation. It is the end of unconscious attachment. You were not abandoned. You were secured,